And then I think in terms of how you would celebrate Easter, we don't really know specifically. I mean, Richard was talking about how a lot of the things, kind of things about Easter eggs or whatever, are modern myths. We don't, have much evidence for particular seasonal customs linked to Easter, other than presumably they feasted, they ate. If this is spring, so there's more food around, in it's sort of the end of the winter sense of privation and hardship. So, that's probably what they did. I think they ate.
I was going to say, Len,
Please.
Where I live, which is very rural Dorset, near the Cerne Abbas Giant, there's still really, I think, well, some things make me a bit uneasy, really. For instance, on Easter morning, people gather at the top of the giant's head, and they dance down into the village, headed by the vicar, where we then meet the Morris dancers in the kind of main street of the village. And this is clearly a custom from time immemorial, and I don't know what it means, and I don't think anybody else does either. They just do it. So actually, customs can survive sort of independent of their original meaning, or perhaps everybody attaches their own meaning to it. But there's quite a lot of that going on. There's the dance down, there's the beating of the bounds of the parish, which still goes on. And I've always been rather worried because there's a monolith not far away. Gosh, I'm getting an echo. There's a monolith not far away, which has a kind of handprint in it, in the top of the stone. And this is called the Devil's Hand. Well, every time I go by, there are offerings in it. This worries me slightly. What are they offering to? Anyway, it's often money, but I never take it. I think that would be really bad luck. But perhaps somebody does, or I don't know, perhaps something else happens to it. But customs like this, sort of well blessing and tying wishes to branches, as at St. Catherine's Well, not far away. This just keeps on going on. It's not encouraged. It's not developed. It's just what people continue to do, and that they seem to have done it for a long, long time.
Yeah, I think that's the question, though, Tom, isn't it? Is how long have they done it for? Oh, I'm not turned on. Am I? Yes, I am. How long have they done it for? We live in an age, don't we, where Christianity has been the faith in these islands for many centuries, but we're an ever more secular society. But there seems to be, I think, a deep need in people for for spirituality, and I think you can see that in lots of sort of New Age and neo-pagan beliefs. But they are quite sort of eclectic in the sense that some of it is a bit of a pick and mix, and it's a sort of pick and mix off the internet of sort of taking folk traditions from here and religious symbolism from there, and whilst I would never be one to say you develop or you see the world as you see fit, you follow your own path. But the trouble is, if we claim there's huge antiquity to these things when there isn't, I think that's problematic. And so, for instance, you mentioned Morris dancers in Cerne Abbas. Well, I'm pretty certain that those Morris dancers wouldn't have been there in the 19th century, and that they're dancing Cotswold Morris tradition. Do you see what I mean? So some elements of it might be quite ancient, but others have probably been added on during the various sort of folk and folkloric revivals that we've seen sort of since the 19th century. And you see that in things, like you get a crossover now between Border Morris and steampunk, dress, and there's lots of this sort of again, it's not that I mean to be critical, but it is a bit like sort of the Wiccan faith and other forms of neo-paganism. They do absorb an awful lot from around the world, but often now through the channel of the internet. It's
yeah. I guess that means that this is, in a sense, a living tradition, which people are, as you say, we know quite well. I don't know if you know the work of my pal Ronald Hutton, who I think is the big authority on neo-paganism. But he is very clear about the way that the Witcher cult, as I call it, I think they call it Wicca, but I think it's Witcher.
I think you're right.
That's right. And it's significant. They don't know how to pronounce it.
Mm.
It's just been made up. Well, Ronald is very clear on the way that this was sort of put together in, I guess, the early 20th century. But once it's been put together, then people, are no longer concerned about its origins. Still, it is a mistake that you can make, I think.
But I think you're quite right though in saying it's the modern folklore. It's developing and using the media of the 21st century.
Yeah. Yes.
I just had a question, really, just about the Yevering grandstand. I was really fascinated, Richard, by that idea of the kind of calendrical alignment of the structure, this sort of seemingly kind of amphitheater wedge type structure. And I have to confess, I only partially followed your kind of technical analysis of that diagram. But I suppose I was just wondering, is there a sense that like that sort of seating area, if that's what it was, would have been used for people to gather at like these significant kind of lunar or solar moments to kind of in some way ritually celebrate them or witness them?
I think that's a very good question, because what we have is we only have the foundation elements of the structure, which are those sort of 9 arcs of the foundations, and then a post as a sort of focal point. And now all the reconstructions have shown them as being as it being a tiered structure. And I think it was. I think it probably was, but we can't definitely say that. We can't prove that it was. But I think the fact that it had a post to cast a shadow over that structure is quite significant, because that would mean that from the focal point you could tie a rope, and you could then actually mark the positions as the sun progresses across the arcs of it through the year. Now, if that was also a position where people could be seated as well as part of, let's say, sort of that sort of reckoning of time. And also sort of celebrating that physically by your presence within the structure. I think that's interesting. The idea of a tiered seating structure doesn't preclude its use as a device for measuring time by sort of solar sunrise shadows cast over the structure. So I think it's the thing is that Richard North at UCL was the person to come up with the suggestion that it had a relationship to the equinox and Eostra. But what I've done is I've actually sort of tied down the precise alignments of the structure, and then related those to actual sort of lunar divisions in terms of lunar months, intervals between them. So it's a theory, it's an idea. I would welcome anybody's further thoughts on it. One doesn't preclude the other.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I spend quite a lot of time at Yevering, so it was particularly compelling to me, that idea. Yeah, thanks.
Right.
Yes. So this question is for Dr. Parker, and I'm one of those people who's in the pagan scene. I'm not a Wiccan myself, but I'm aware. I get a lot of questions from people because I teach about folklore and paganism, some research that I do. I'm a medievalist myself, and folks really want to know about equinoxes and in pagan tradition. And my impression is that aside from administrative holidays and what's grown around that in folklore, like the feast days of Michaelmas and is it Lady Day in the spring?
Yeah.
That there wasn't as much or there isn't as much to find, maybe, is my impression. And I know that we have Wicca came up with Mabon, and that always felt a bit funny to me. But I guess my question is just, can you shine any light on what the equinoxes might have meant to the Anglo-Saxons, if anything at all?
I think your impression is absolutely right. That's my impression too, that in fact the equinoxes were less important than the solstices, that midwinter and midsummer were obviously very important points in the year for the the pagan culture, but that actually the equinoxes, I mean, we don't even have a pre-Christian word for equinox. We've only got an Old English version of the Latin name. And I mean, so obviously Rich has been talking about Eastermonth and that which is presumably linked to the spring equinox, but whether exactly that's, you know, what kind of form that festival might have taken, we really don't know. And the autumnal equinox, probably what Bede says about the month of Winterfylleth, he doesn't say this, but I think this is the idea that basically it's, you know, the kind of transition from summer to winter would occur at the first full moon after the autumnal equinox. I think that's basically what he's saying. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean it was a festival or that it was actually marked or celebrated, or at least, you know, maybe it was, but we really can't say. So it's an interesting absence, and it might just be that we, you know, maybe there was evidence that Bede didn't know about, and that's why we can't say much about it. But I do think, you know, my sense of, from the later sources as well, is that the equinoxes were kind of quite easily, you know, just superseded by the Christian equivalents like Michaelmas and Lady Day, Easter, whatever, and kind of didn't, there wasn't really any sense of a continuing popular culture around them either. So yeah, I'm afraid that's not very helpful, but you're right. Basically, I think you're right in your impression.
Okay. Thank you. Can I ask a follow-up question just quickly?
Sure.
I'm wondering if you tracked a sense of, like, because the transition between the seasons, like say the end of October or the beginning of May, those, if we're thinking on a 2-season system, those seem like more significant events. And I wonder if, I guess it's just like that's when that would be seen in the environment, whereas the equinox maybe is a bit abstract. I wonder, does that sound relevant to you?
Yeah, well, I think so. That's very interesting about the beginning of November and the beginning of May, because of course those are the beginning of summer and winter in the Celtic calendar, aren't they? So that's like Beltane and Samhain. And I think we don't really see either of those dates as particularly important in the Anglo-Saxon calendar. They, you know, they're just not really there at all. But as I said, maybe the first full moon after the equinox, which would be more like probably, you know, sometime in October or sometime in April, might be what was important.
Yeah, I guess I'm transposing those sort of months onto them.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, you know, how do the months match up with our calendar is, you know, a difficult question.
Could I perhaps just come in on the back of that, Eleanor? That if, let's say, Bede tells us that the full moon of Winterfylleth was significant, you know, because it was the first full moon of the winter half year, then I suppose, you know, I would argue, therefore, then that the first full moon of Eastermonth was the first full moon of the summer half year, and that would at least suggest, perhaps not, let's say, as important as Yule and Litha, because they are quite clearly flanked by these two double months, but certainly it would suggest that the equinox was recognized, because of course it would have to be recognized in order to establish the first full moon of that season or of that half year.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think they must have been aware of it and in some way tracked it, you know, as you were talking about. But the difficulty, I suppose, is trying to work out what they were doing to mark it. You know, did they just notice it as this is where we are in the year now, or was there some kind of, you know, celebration or festival? That's what we kind of don't know, I suppose.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, Dr. Parker, thank you very much for your lecture. I have a few questions about Mother's Night. I wonder, what do we know about Mother's Night? Who were the mothers being honored? Are they the matroni? And what specific customs or rituals were involved?
Oh, well, I didn't talk about that because I know that the previous talk in this series discussed that in great detail. So you might want to just go and watch that one. I think that's on YouTube. But so, yeah, briefly, we don't know very much, but it seems to have been a group of mother goddesses. Yes, maybe the matroni, the matrons and so on that we see in kind of, you know, sculptures and so on from Roman Britain and other parts of Europe. Specific customs or rituals, who knows? Vigils, Bede says, that they observed through that night. So they stayed up all night. It was probably the winter solstice, but what they were doing, we don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And there's a question, Eleanor, about Hallowtide and how it was observed. Do we know anything about that?
Well, so Hallowtide is really a late medieval development, at least in England. So it has an interesting history. You know, Rich has been talking, for instance, about the conflation between the Anglo-Saxon and the Celtic calendars, and how that can maybe, you know, be misleading today. And this is one example of that, because clearly Hallowtide, as we would recognise it, Halloween and the association with the dead and so on, it has quite strong roots in Irish and Celtic tradition. It doesn't really have a strong position in the Anglo-Saxon calendar. All Saints' Day existed in the Anglo-Saxon period. It wasn't that important compared to some of the other festivals I talked about. And so the connection with Souls and All Souls' Day, for instance, develops later in the medieval period, like post-Anglo-Saxon in England. So it was a Saints' Day, that's all we can say, but no sort of associations that we would link to Hallowtide, like prayers for the dead or soul cakes or whatever that might be.
Well, I'd like to ask you a question, Eleanor. In your talk, you mentioned something that I find very interesting. You were going through elements of what Bede says about the pre-Christian reckoning of time and what is corroborated by other sources and what is not corroborated by other sources. And you mentioned that one of the details in Bede that is corroborated by other sources is reckoning time into 2 seasons per year, just summer and winter, as something that we find elsewhere. And I can think you can't, my background's not showing it, but as a scholar of Beowulf, I can think, of course, in Beowulf, there is that phrase, hund missera, generally translated as 100 half years. So that would be one piece of evidence to corroborate Bede. And then also in the Old High German poem, the Hildebrandslied, there is a reference to Hildebrand being in exile for 60 summers and winters, by which is meant 30 years. So those are 2 things I could think of that corroborate that. I wonder, do you perceive a change over time where this dichotomous approach to the reckoning of time gradually fades under Latin influence? Or do you find evidence for that consistently throughout the period?
So I would say, this is kind of just my impression really, but that the sense of a 4-season year and the importance of spring and autumn and so on really is one of the changes that I was talking about in the post-conquest period. That in fact, in sort of in the later Middle Ages in England, and certainly in Middle English literature, we have much more of a sense of spring and autumn as distinct seasons. Whereas I think actually right through the Anglo-Saxon period, certainly there are sources which talk about the 4 seasons and have a sense of what spring might be and so on. But there's so many more of the kinds of references to summer and winter that you're mentioning. I mean, obviously, as I say, it's not just the case in Anglo-Saxon England, but in other Germanic and Scandinavian cultures too. So yeah, that idea that, you count time by winters, or you talk about summer and winter as a kind of, meaning all the time, like to mean like night and day, like we would say, like they comprise time. And, you can see it in the history of the words in English that, the words for spring and harvest, autumn have been very fluid in their meaning over time, whereas summer and winter have basically not changed in the past 1,000 years. And so, there clearly was a shift in the sort of 14th century where people were kind of talking more about spring, for instance, and they started to come up with another word for spring that wasn't Lencton anymore. And, somebody like Chaucer was very important in kind of introducing new ways of writing about spring and talking about spring, in a literary context. But I think that is also the period in which we start to see records of, for instance, May Day celebrations, which we don't get in Anglo-Saxon sources at all. So I think that idea of the 4-season year certainly did permeate into, culture more broadly, but it took quite a long time. And I think right through the Anglo-Saxon period, there is a sense that it's really summer and winter, and then spring and autumn are maybe sort of subsidiary parts of the year. They're there, but they're not quite as well defined, perhaps.
Again, sorry to but I think Perhaps we also have to consider the Old High German evidence as well, though, because we do, of course, have Lenz and Herbst in German as well, which seem to correlate perfectly with sort of the late sort of West Saxon division of the year. But perhaps again, that's a result of the Anglo-Saxon mission. I don't know. It's but you have a similar division there, and they do seem to be parallels.
Well, harvest, for instance, is a good example, because that's not really a season of the year, is it? It's talking about harvest, and actually that could be defined just about as long as the harvest goes on. So it's not surprising, absolutely, that we find that name in other Germanic languages, but whether that's sort of a unit of time as part of the year is maybe a slightly different question.
Yes, but in German, the word for harvest is Ernte, isn't it? And Herbst is the season. So I think it's possibly a little bit more to explore there.
Sure, Professor. So I've got, I know disappointingly little about non-Proto-Indo-European mythology and culture. So I'm really curious, can we speak to the contrast between things like what we see in Anglo-Saxon England and stuff like that, and like say like China or Arabia, or like, do we know that this is really a Proto-Indo-European phenomenon and not like a human one?
So Richard,
Sorry,
yeah.
yes, I'm responding now. Sorry, just unmuted. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think sort of, if you look at human cultures around the world and the way that they divide up the year, the solstices and equinoxes, but also sort of, I suppose, the cross quarters as well, how they divide the seasons. There is similarity, but there are also distinct differences between different cultures as well. So it's a good question, but probably the subject matter for a much bigger book, I would imagine, than mine. So but I do take your point.
Sure, yeah, thanks. So I was just curious if Eleanor or Richard could shed any light on how well attested are kind of British Celtic pre-Christian sort of seasonal festivities and calendar days, as opposed to the kind of Anglo-Saxon pre-Christian ones, or do we sort of roughly infer that they're kind of similar to what we know of Ireland?
Well, the earliest references we do have to the seasons are, in terms of sort of native to these islands, would be the Irish ones, and that's sort of in the Táin, Bo Cuchulainn, the Hound of Ulster, that as a hero he's required to go sleepless for a whole year before Emma will agree to marry him. That's the story, and in that text it describes the four cross quarter days, that mark the changing of the seasons, though at least one of them in a much earlier form. But that's generally the earliest record that people quote back to. But then they became well established as the quarter days in the Irish church, and certainly it's quarter days in Scotland as well. Whereas in England and in Wales, it was the equinox and the solstices largely. Okay, so Christmas through to Lady Day, and then Midsummer Day, St. John's, and then Michaelmas. They became the quarter days generally in England. So it is quite interesting that you get this difference between the two. But Eleanor might be able to add a bit more than me to that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, basically, the best records are from Ireland, and so we have to kind of assume that there was some similarities. And I think the Irish sources are pretty good, but obviously they are also often reflecting a pagan, ideas through a Christian lens or whatever. So that's always an issue to deal with as well. But yeah, I think if what you mean by British Celtic is like the island of Britain, it's often we have to kind of infer or read across from what's in Ireland, really.
Yes, yeah, I suppose I'm kind of referring to the Celtic speaking regions of Britain, potentially even those that persisted to speak Celtic languages kind of into the Anglo-Saxon period, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think one very sorry.
But maybe they'd all Christianized by that point anyway, I suppose.
I think the one thing we have to be aware of, though, and be careful of, is not inferring that Gaelic and British culture is identical. So, for instance, we have evidence of the quarter days, the cross quarter days, in sort of Ireland and in the Isle of Man and in Scotland amongst the Gaelic-speaking communities. but we don't have that same evidence within the Brythonic, language group within Cornish or Welsh or Breton culture. So and often you'll see this sort of Irish sources being used to infer a sort of a uniformity across the Celtic language group. So I think we have to be aware of that we don't have that evidence within Britain itself.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing I would just say is that often when, like with the kind of Anglo-Saxon sources I was talking about, they are quite localized to particular regions of Anglo-Saxon England. So there probably were, I'm sure there were, parts of the country, maybe like further north, closer to the borders of what's now the borders of Scotland, where obviously the picture would have been much more complicated. So we're often getting, like pure Anglo-Saxon sources, but probably it was a more composite or more complicated picture in different regions.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question, and thank you, Eleanor and Richard, for your answers. We've gone over time, but this has been great. Actually, to conclude this excellent meeting, I was just thinking we might end perhaps with maybe Richard, if you'd like to ask a question of Eleanor, and then in reverse, Eleanor, if you'd like to ask a question of Richard, and we could wrap things up that way. So, Richard, you can go first.
Thank you. Yes, I suppose my question to Eleanor would be, and I was fascinated by the links you made with your discussion of Lammas in particular, because that's always fascinated me as to whether there was a sort of a pre-Christian sort of harvest loaf blessing ceremony, particularly with the charm that we have for blessing a barn. I thought, is there a pre-Christian element to that? But I think I wonder, you mentioned whether it's, let's say, a time at which, they could have been introduced to the idea of blessing bread for the Eucharist. If you maybe could sort of elaborate on that a little bit more, if you think do you think that would have been, let's say, there might have been a pagan bread blessing tradition, but there would seem to be some synergy then with the Eucharist?
Well, I think, we don't know, basically, but it's a possibility. I think I was, mostly thinking about this. There's a story that Bede tells about the early days of some Anglo-Saxon converts who really sort of struggled with the idea of consecrated bread. Why are you eating this bread or whatever? And, it would be a part of having to introduce people to Christianity to talk about the ritual of bread blessing and what it meant and all that kind of stuff. And so, you might see conversations around that ritual or that idea as maybe part of the conversion process. And I think the other thing is that blessing lots of different crops and objects and all kinds of things was a part of medieval Christian ritual practice. So something like the blessing of the, you crumble bits of the blessed bread around the barn at Lammas is actually very much in line with a lot of Christian practices for kind of consecration and blessing and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting place where either pagan and Christian ideas might have sort of interacted and where they might have found communality, or where the Christian way of doing things might have offered a different sort of ritual to what had been there before. I mean, a harvest, you could very much imagine a harvest festival that didn't need any bread blessing. You could just be celebrating the harvest, couldn't you?
Harvest home.
So, we don't know really.
Thank you.
And Eleanor, would you like to ask a question of Richard?
Yes, I was very interested by, I like what you talk about with the, the modern interpretations of Aistre and the development of the kind of modern Wheel of the Year and so on. And you mentioned the influence of the Shire calendar on that. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yes. I think Aidan Kelly in California, who is credited with establishing Ostara, Litha, and Mabon within the Wiccan or the Wiccan calendar. He seemed to talk about sort of Grimm potentially as an influencer for the name Ostara, but I think it was possibly Ronald Hutton who'd first pointed out that when he describes the months of the Anglo-Saxon year, he uses Tolkien's forms for Yule and after Yule and for Litha and after Litha, suggesting that might have been his Aidan Kelly's source. So Ronald Hutton writes a bit more about this.
Great, thank you.
Thanks. And actually, I lied. I want to ask one more question before we go. So, Eleanor, you mentioned in your talk the literary sources that tell us things about the seasons, such as Maxims 2 and also Beowulf. Now, as a commentator on Beowulf and a fanatic of Beowulf, I would just like to ask you, and I believe, of course, that you must teach Beowulf regularly at Oxford. Knowing what you know about the reckoning of time in the Old English period, how does that affect your understanding of Beowulf? I mean, there's the reference to known in it, and I know there is some controversy about the meaning of that word. There's also the debate about Wheel Dias, Beowulf's underground for the space of a day. So I'd just like to put that to you and ask you to share your thoughts on Beowulf.
That's okay. So that's lots of things, and I shouldn't say too much about it. I'll say that the part of Beowulf, which to me always seems most kind of revelatory in thinking about the seasons, is the story of Hengist and the conflict at Finnsburn. You know, the role that what the poet calls a blood-stained winter. That idea of a group of people who are kind of trapped in a situation where they don't want to be in the aftermath of conflict, and they have to kind of live through a tense, blood-stained winter until the point that the spring comes again, or the new year starts, or however you want to translate what that poet means by year. I think that sense of like enduring through the winter is something that you could read, interestingly, maybe not just in that story, but also the sense of, you know, the darkness that surrounds Heorot and Grendel out there in the, you know, lurking in the darkness. Is that a kind of midwinter setting as well? You know, I think, I mean, Tom was talking earlier about the kind of the importance of winter in the Anglo-Saxon psyche, and maybe you could see Beowulf as reflecting something about the threats of winter and in the way that, you know, that difficulty of enduring through winter. And, you know, I think the poet kind of brings that to life very vividly.